We are on. Okay. Welcome everybody, or not.
It's loading, it's loading, it's loading. We are alive.
Yes. Okay, we are in. Okay, welcome everybody. Today is Tuesday, 8 p.m. and we promise to us and to everybody that we will have a meeting with Roger Hallam. Roger is here with us and you are also here with us, and it's a good opportunity to have a meeting and to chat and to discuss what is important for us and what brought us here. And first, I will announce very shortly just 3 or 4 technical issues for all of you. As you know, Roger Hallam is trying to learn Polish, but he's still on his way. So we decided to keep this conversation in English and this meeting in English. And I hope you are fine with that. And later on, we will do a translation and we will post the whole meeting with a Polish subtitles on YouTube channel and on the other social media channels. So don't worry, we will share it and we will have access so we can come back to this conversation and also follow that or learn from that also in our mother tongue. So this is it. And we also have a chat, and we set up the chat for you to be able to type the questions to us, because in the second part of this meeting we will have a short Q&A, question and answers meeting, so you can have a question to Roger and he will try to answer that. Probably if we will have a lot of them, we will pick few of them and ask Roger to answer them. So please type your questions in the chat, or please type your questions in a Facebook chat comments as well. If you are typing the questions here in the Zoom, please type the questions to Przemo. Przemo is one of the co-hosts, so you can, so he will collect and later on he will pick up a few questions and read it loud to Roger, and and we will make this conversation. So as you already heard, we will have this conversation in 2 parts. First part, we will ask Roger to make a talk and to have a small discussion, and that for the first part that will take us about 40-45 minutes, and later on we will start Q&A session which might take 10 to 30 minutes. We will see how many questions we will have and how this part will go on. I will just check, do I set everything what I should? Yes, I think so. So so we are ready to start the conversation and the talk right now. So Roger, hello, really glad to have you here and to have this conversation, especially right now and in the moment we have 2021. We are on the very beginning. Extension Rebellion Poland is also in the very important moment because we are rebooting, we are entering new year, and we are also making a really great effort to mass mobilize. And as probably the whole Extension Rebellion, we also went through this period of movement building, going a little bit down, and now we're going into this major period of the movement where we need to redefine the structures, the system, how to collaborate with each other, how to deal with our internal issues, how to grow from that point, how to take a lesson we have from the past, and also we have from the other movements, from the other branches, as well as XR UK. We are really curious about XR UK way from the very beginning to here. And as you know, because we had a chance to talk, we are also in this very exciting period in Poland right now, because despite even the Corona times, which is also a very big momentum in the human history, we had this mass mobilization and all Poland women's strike has invited Polish people to go out on the streets, and we went on and we did a great momentum as well. So that also mobilized many people who are eager to keep going, and many of us would like to join the movement, which as a most important issue works and fights for the climate issues, and with the climate crisis as a main and the most challenging issue in the human history. So this is where we are, and we really like you to help us to structure and to start a new year with your help. Please go on.
Okay, thanks very much, and hello everyone. Thank you so much for having me speak to you. I'm very grateful for the opportunity, and I just want to start by thanking you for all your bravery and hard work over the previous months. You've been inspiring people around XR around the world and lots of other people, so I very much appreciate your efforts and feel quite humbled, as I usually do when I get to speak to people. I just want to go through a few sort of initial things in case it's not obvious. I'm only speaking for myself. I'm not formally speaking on behalf of any Extinction Rebellion group. That's what I always do. So that's the situation on that. I obviously want to apologize for being characteristically English and not knowing any foreign languages, which is a national failing. I'm a classic example of that. So sorry, my Polish isn't quite up to scratch. I also want to apologize or acknowledge before I start any incoherence in my arguments that I want to present to you. It's a great responsibility to be talking about this subject because of the extreme seriousness of the situation we're in. And I see myself very much in a dialogical relationship, in dialogue with other intellectuals and influencers around the world on exactly how we are going to navigate the next 20 or 30 years. And as you may know, most of the time I spend talking to people and researching more sort of mundane subjects of how to get, people into meetings and out of meetings feeling empowered. So it feels a little bit abstract to be talking about such a big subject as revolution in the 21st century. However, I do passionately believe that if we're going to be successful in our efforts over the next 5 to 10 years, we have to have a really clear idea of why radical movements have failed in the past and how they're going to succeed in the future. And that requires like a strategic overview of what needs to be done and how. And it also requires a sort of larger sense of you influencing history, right? This isn't a consumer, emailing campaign by a Vaz, right? This is it. It's the real world, and it's going to come and bite us in many ways, as we're already realizing. So there is, in a sense, nothing more serious than the topic I'm going to talk about. Okay, so I'm going to start off with a quote by the British philosopher John Locke, who's an English Civil War philosopher in the 17th century. And he, for his sins, had a number of things to say about subjects around that period in history. And the quote that I'm going to quote was on the beginning of the Declaration of Rebellion against the British government in October 2018. And the quote, I think, has a transcultural, ahistorical resonance, as you might say. And it goes as follows, which is to love truth for truth's sake is the principal part of perfection in this world and the seed plot of all other virtues. And there's an important reason why this was the founding quote of Extinction Rebellion, which was the proposition that only by staying within the truth can you remain virtuous. And on a social level, that means if a society engages in a self-evident lie, then that society will become unvirtuous and decay and collapse. And we know this, of course, not least in Eastern Europe in the period up to 1989, when society lived an enormous lie. And my proposition, I suppose, is that societies now are also living a massive lie. And that lie is that things can carry on the way they are without creating ecological and social collapse. So that's the reality that we find ourselves in, is this massive lie that we are facing. So to ground that, I suppose, in some reality, the first sense of that lie is the COVID crisis that everyone's facing around the world, that all of a sudden within 3 or 4 weeks the global economy was closed down because of a microscopic virus which invades the human body. And the reason for that, as we know, is because of the extreme pressures on the natural world from human intrusion and extraction. So what we know is that COVID is the first step towards this ecological, economic and social collapse. And at a recent conference 2 weeks ago, it was confirmed that we're now at 1.3 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures, and we'll be heading over 1.5 degrees in the next 5 to 10 years. And due to the Arctic melting at some point in the 2030s, and due to global dimming, that is pollution in the atmosphere, being reduced, then we're looking at going over 2 degrees centigrade in the early 2030s, certainly before 2040. So that really is the massive game changer that my sort of discussion is going to be based on. In other words, like as we hit 2 degrees centigrade, a recent peer-reviewed paper suggested that there'll be 1,000 million refugees on the go. So this is the pivot, I suppose, between the pivot from traditional one-issue environmentalism, talking about penguins and ice and glaciers and such like, and it's the pivot towards actually what climate change means. What climate change means is economic collapse due to the mass forced migration of hundreds of millions of people over the next 10 to 20 years. So the first experience of climate collapse will be COVID-like events. In other words, economic depression, the loss of opportunities, the loss of welfare services, social stress. And then that follows on to social collapse, which is in its full horror, mass rape, slaughter, and starvation. That's the reality that Extinction Rebellion has given itself the job to communicate to the world, that this is no longer an environmental question, it's primarily a question of political corruption. In other words, our focus going forward as a new revolutionary movement that we need to be is to focus on the state and the political class that controls the state, and the desire of that political class to send the next generation into hell because it's unable or unwilling to challenge the corporate global regime. So that sort of is the introduction to why we're talking about revolution this evening. What everyone agrees with at this stage in history is there needs to be a massive economic transformation. There's nothing radical about that observation, right? There's been a report out by the Bank of England in the UK saying so, and Bill Gates, if you've read the article, has already just published a book saying exactly the same thing. The reason why the Bank of England and Bill Gates are historically and politically illiterate is because they don't understand that the only way, sociologically speaking, you can bring about massive economic change in a short period of time is through mass political disruption. In other words, a political revolution. So that's why we have to engage in a realist sense on what this revolution is going to look like, because this revolution is inevitable at this stage of history, because the social collapse is now locked in. So the question is, do we have a progressive, radical democratic revolution, or do we, by various stages and collapses, return to their days of fascism and authoritarianism? That's the key question for our generation, and particularly for the younger generation at this point. In other words, it's like an intensely political question. We're not in the days of surface reformist environmentalism anymore because of the absolute extremity of what we face. So I want to say a little bit technically about what I mean by a revolution. So I've got a technical and precise definition of what it means. I don't want to give the impression tonight that I'm talking about some vague utopian, like airy-fairy idea. A political revolution is a sociological category. It means that you're removing not just the government, but the political regime, but you're maintaining the existence of the state. Those are all different things. Okay, so we're taking away the regime, the neoliberal regime, which stands behind all the corrupted representational democracy parties. Okay, this is juxtaposed to the notion of reformism, when you have an issue and you influence a policy of a government. They're very different things. Okay, so the question that I want to consider for the rest of my talk is, how do you construct this revolution, given that the objective conditions of revolution are rapidly approaching and arguably present in Poland at the present time? So what I want to suggest is that Poland, this is the bit where it gets a bit stressful for you, but I would like to suggest that Poland is in a particular political sweet spot, in the sense that it's possible to have a successful revolution in Poland and similar countries. And I want to explain why that's potentially the case. So I think the first reason is because Poland, as I understand it, has a very recent understanding of what authoritarianism looks like, not least because of the experience before 1989. And of course, the spectre of authoritarianism is very present at the present moment, right? Now, that's very different to Western societies like in the UK or Canada or Australia, who have a certain complacency about their liberties and their freedoms. And that leads to a very difficult job in actually creating mobilization. While potentially in Eastern Europe and Poland, there's a greater seriousness and realism about what social evil looks like. And the other aspect that puts Poland in the spotlight, I suppose, is that unlike very authoritarian or repressed societies, there's still a degree of education and liberty that provides the potentiality to organize effectively and overcome a regime. In other words, you have that sweet spot combination. It's not super repressed, but it's not super complacent. So what I'm interested in doing, of course, is talking to you guys and putting forward what I see as some of the main elements of what a successful revolution would look like. And I want to acknowledge at this point that that I'm very much standing on the shoulders of giants here, in so much as a lot of what I'm saying has been put forward by other scholars and intellectuals. I think what I'm hoping to do tonight is to bring together the various elements in so much as they can become synergistic and enable a success to happen. The other thing I just want to say is that I think this discussion is extremely important, and it's extremely important that we consider, like, in an open way, the various potentialities and possibilities. And we do that in a way that is not repressive. In other words, we need to have an open debate on the left where people can speak their minds and say things that are potentially unacceptable about the failures of the left without being cancelled. And obviously, as you may know, that's one of the problems that I've been subjected to, because I like to say what I think. So I'm going to sort of be fairly critical, not because I'm trying to be unpleasant or show lack of solidarity, but because We have to be ruthlessly honest with ourselves, like John Locke says, in order to be successful. Okay, so I'm going to run through 4 or 5 key elements that I think are essential in a 21st century revolution. I'm going to run through them fairly quickly because in a short 45-minute talk, I can't really go into great detail. So you might want to ask me about some in more detail. But hopefully it's going to give you a flavor of the very different direction revolution has to take in the 21st century to avoid the mistakes of the 19th and 20th centuries. All right, so the first point I want to make is really foundational, which is why I'm saying it first, which is any revolutionary movement that's going to be successful in a progressive sense has to have non-violence at the core of its philosophy of action. That has to be absolutely essential, and there can't be compromise on it. There's an extensive literature that shows that if violence enters into a movement in any substantial way, then it degenerates the movement and degrades the movement into a macho and authoritarian and closed culture. That in itself, of course, is politically problematic and unethical. But a more important point here is that any successful revolution that's going to be progressive has to encourage mass participation. Mass participation fundamentally means the engagement of the old people, young people, and women. And any violent revolution usually degrades into a young man's routine, okay? And it's basically a numbers game, as you're probably aware from the research from Erica Chenoweth and similar scholars, that what you need to do is create a low entry cost. In other words, it's easy to go onto the street. It's not easy to join a terrorist cell or a guerrilla movement. And this is the primary non-moral reason why violent revolutions are generally unsuccessful. And we should also consider, of course, that in so much as they are successful, historically 95% of them lead to civil war, authoritarianism, or social collapse within 5 years. In other words, you win, but you lose. So that's something that we really need to close the book on as we move forward. The second key element of revolution in 21st century is mass mobilization, which is one of the things that I work on. What mass mobilization basically means is it's a modern word for the classical sort of revolutionary strategy, which was called go to the people. So go to the people was used by Russian revolutionaries in the 19th century or revolutionaries after 1968 in the Third World. What it means is to get out of your bubble of comfortable middle-class intellectual urban life and go out into the regions, into the towns, into the countryside and speak with ordinary people. And the fundamental element of successful progressive revolution is not to go to the people with a top-down, authoritarian, dogmatic ideology in the classical sort of vulgar Marxist tradition. The psychology of mass mobilization is fundamentally based upon the notion of people engaging in the act of speech. In other words, encouraging people to speak, not talking to people. And there's this particular format of doing that, which in the UK and maybe in other countries is called people's assemblies, where people come together. And the primary purpose of the episode is to enable people to listen to each other. And through people listening to each other, they naturally radicalize rather than being told to radicalize by some self-important urban intellectuals. Okay, so this is a fundamental break from the authoritarian, like revolutionary tradition. And this has been shown to work over and over again in supporting the first point, which is mass participation, civil disobedience. People need to own their movement in order to engage in civil disobedience. And they do that by being allowed to speak and creating their own sort of radical reality, as it were. So the third point, which is sort of related to it, is this notion of beyond politics, which is one of the slogans of Extinction Rebellion. And I'd like to suggest that one of the reasons why Extinction Rebellion has been so successful around the world is not so much because of its proposal to engage in civil disobedience, but because of its reconfiguration of what we mean by politics itself. So one of the disasters of the left over the last 30 years and even longer has been the reduction of politics into some analysis of power and inequality. Important as that analysis is, that's not primarily what motivates many people to engage in resistance. What enables people to engage in mass civil disobedience and social movements is primarily sociability. By sociability, I mean the non-political culture of a group that's supporting, welcoming, fun, cultural, and humanizing. And this is something the left never gets because it has a sort of enlightenment dogma that you convince people through hard political ideas. You don't. It's sociologically and psychologically illiterate due to modern research. Most people will join Extinction Rebellion in Poland because it's cool, right? They like the people in it. They feel loved by the people in it. The people are welcoming. They don't give people a shitty time, right? So this is essential. And also, of course, it's intrinsically progressive because the reductive political culture of the left over the last century has led to the authoritarianism that we've seen in many countries, not least Poland. Okay, so that leads on to the next point, which is about coalition building. So there's a lot of misunderstandings about coalition building in the sense of movement of movements. So the idea, the traditional idea, is that elite actors, elite political actors in big cities go and coalition build with other elite actors in big cities. In other words, you get together all the elites, the counter elites, and they engage in some sort of social confrontation. There's a big reason why that doesn't work, because most of the left and progressive political elites have no interest in revolution, right? They're primarily interested in gatekeeping and maintaining their reformist agendas, not least because they're already in positions of power. So the strategy for coalition building has to be to talk to the individuals in those demographics and groups, not the leaders of them. So for instance, going to talk to trade union branches, not talking to trade union leaders, right? That's the revolutionary sort of tradition. And what's very important, and this is a massive challenge to the closed culture of left-wing groups, is you have to start talking, or rather listening, to groups that you traditionally don't like, because those groups are going to enable you to create the mass movement. You're not going to create the mass movement by students from a few elite universities around the cities of Poland or any other country. You're going to do it by talking to the far larger demographics in the country. And some of those demographics in terms of revolutionary history determine the success of a revolution. In other words, there's certain groups that start off conservative, but in revolutionary periods move to the left. And they move to the left because they're invited in by a welcoming culture of the revolutionary movement. So 3 groups that spring to mind are farmers. Farmers, as we should know, like myself, have been fucked over by the neoliberal system for 30 years. And the only reason they're not moving to the left, as I see it, is because of the cultural blocks imposed on them by the cultural elites of the big cities. If you speak to them or enable them to speak, they're perfectly capable of moving in a radical direction, not least because they're going to lose their livelihoods over the next 10 to 20 years. The second group is small business people in the cities who have, again, been destroyed by neoliberalism and the unfairness of corporate capitalism. And again, these are hardworking people. They're not oppressors. They're people that are part of the coalition. And the third group, which might sound problematic in Poland, but I still want to tell it to you, is the church. The church usually, as we all know, is a bastion of conservatism. However, historically, at periods of social injustice, significant proportions of the church, not least the lay people in the church, are capable of making an alliance with the radical elements in society. You saw this, for instance, in the revolution against Marcos in the Philippines in 1984, where when the Catholic Church came over to the revolutionary movement, then the regime collapsed in a matter of weeks. So there's a big challenge there. And again, the key element to it is to go and listen to the groups. Don't go and argue with them, right? Because through that listening, you'll get some respect, mutual respect, and you can grow. And another little add-on here, which is a broader point about getting ordinary people into the movement, is one of the biggest disasters of radical middle-class movements in the Western world has been the inability to talk everyday language. Everyday language is an essential element in the mobilization effort. Like professional university language is the language of oppression for the majority of the population. That's how they perceive it. So as soon as you go and talk all the long words that get you good marks in university essays, you immediately alienate ordinary people. And so you need to learn how to speak in ordinary language, or more importantly, recruit people from ordinary demographics to talk to ordinary people. So you had farmers talking to farmers, Catholics talking to Catholics, small business people talking to small business people. That's how you grow a movement to the extent that is necessary. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the fifth thing, which is a more political point and quite a big break from the revolutions over the last 100 years. Broadly speaking, we can see revolutions over this period breaking into two groups. So there's the traditional sort of hard left Marxist sort of revolutions that we saw in Russia and in China and various parts of the global south, where you have a revolutionary top-down authoritarian revolution, and we sort of know all the horrors that brings, right? But we've also seen in the last 30 to 40 years what you might call neoliberal revolutions, i.e. the colour revolutions in Eastern Europe and in the Middle East. Now, these revolutions, as we know, have been opposed to authoritarian regimes that have been very nasty. However, they've all failed in varying extents, as we're aware, because they've been revolutions that instituted the neoliberal global order. And that's been manifested through the introduction of parliamentary representational democracy. Now, as we should all know, parliamentary representational democracy in a neoliberal global regime simply replicates the interests of the global economic capitalist class. And that creates corruption, and it creates co-option and alienation. And one of the main reasons, of course, for the rise of right-wing populist movements has been the inability of governments to look after people in this sort of global regime that's undercut people's culture and economic security. So the massive big move here in the 21st century is to completely move away in a structural sense from those two revolutionary models, because both of them have catastrophically failed. What we need to have in the 21st century is a reinvention of what radical democracy always meant, going back to ancient Athens. And that's the creation of assemblies of ordinary people who are selected randomly from the population. And the big advantage of this is that it destroys the ability of powerful groups to control who makes decisions, because who gets in the assembly is decided by chance. But potentially more importantly, the optics of this sort of revolution are truly revolutionary, in the sense that a bus driver from Warsaw or a farmer from Krakow will be seen to be making the decisions for the first time in Polish history, or in the first time in the history of any state. That's a true revolution. And it has two impacts. What it does is it brings people together. If people deliberate freely, they move in a progressive direction, a common sense direction. In other words, you can create the radicalism of a left revolution without the imposition of a top-down authoritarian methods, okay? Because the radicalism comes up through deliberation, not down from a revolutionary elite. And at the same time, it protects the state from neoliberal co-option, because once you put people together, then they will resist the corruption of the neoliberal system because they won't rely on it for their power. So what you see over and over again on the prototypical citizen assemblies that have happened is that solutions and proposals come forward which are in direct conflict with the neoliberal regime. You've seen that in France with the demand, for instance, for a completely different economic system. So this is like a genius discovery or rediscovery of what 20th century revolution needs to look like, which is revolutionary, but also deliberative and progressive. And that's obviously what we're looking at. Okay, so I'm going to go over two final sort of broad themes, which I think, you know, are overarching ideas about how this is going to be achieved. So the first one is about the critical role of leadership in revolutionary movements. So one of the biggest challenges and one of the biggest difficulties, particularly in the Western world, with constructing a genuine revolutionary movement, which is sustainable and actually can take control of the state, is the dogma of horizontalism. Now, horizontalism, if you're not aware of that idea, is that there can be no leaders and everything has to be decided by everyone. And the classic example of this is the Occupy movement in the early 2000s. Now, as a sociological observer of this, this creates two phenomena. The first phenomena is massive, rapid growth. The great advantage of horizontalism is there's no gatekeepers, so everyone can just get on with it. And that's why Occupy, for instance, spread around the world in a matter of weeks. So far, so good. However, the paradox of horizontalism, as you might say, is the very thing that leads to its result, to its success, is the very thing that destroys it. In other words, once you create a mass mobilization, if there's no structure, then it degenerates and collapses as rapidly as it grows. In other words, it's no solution to what it sets out to solve, which is the old authoritarian leftist sort of orientation. So what we've got to reinvent, as it were, or discover, is a middle way between that old left authoritarianism and the disastrous inability of mass movements to take control of the state, which is absolutely necessary at this point in history. So what we need to return to, in my view, is what you might call the social democratic leadership structures that were used by Martin Luther King and by the Congress Party and Gandhi in the 1930s. And what that means is limited, accountable, and elected leaderships. And those leaderships then have autonomy to make decisions on behalf of the movement so that rapid decisions can be made in order to take control of the state or bring the state into negotiation. This is not utopian, okay, but it's functional. Nothing really that I'm saying in this talk is utopian, right? It's all stuff that can and should happen. But there's another element to leadership, which I think is absolutely essential in order to overcome a political regime. And that's the ability to escalate and to tactically maneuver. One of the biggest problems with horizontalism is it's tactically stupid. It's not able to make good general-esque decisions in the sense of, we're not going to go to the streets today, we're going to go tomorrow. We're going to go to that part of the city today, but not tomorrow. We're going to go to that city, but not that city. In other words, revolutions need generals. They need to have people who can direct the point to the opponent's weakest point. You saw this in Gandhi, you saw this in Martin Luther King, you saw it in the Iranian Revolution. All revolutions basically have a leadership structure that tactically maneuvers the forces. I mean, what you should be aware of is in classical civil disobedience, in classical nonviolence, the idea is you're engaging in a war, but it's a war without violence, but it's still a war. It has generals, it has forces, and it has campaigns. So that relates to the second point, which is leadership is critically necessary in order to take the massive risks which are necessary in order to overcome a regime. A regime is not overcome by a cautious revolutionary leadership, right? One of the biggest problems with mobilizations over the last 10, 20 years, and arguably this was the case with what happened in Belarus, was the reliance on a single tactic. So in Occupy, for instance, it was just occupying a particular space. In Belarus, it was a Saturday march. All successful revolutions, as far as I can see, engage in a plurality of non-violent tactics, which escalate. And the key mechanism of success is to create a provocation to the opponent, which leads to repression and then a backfiring effect. Now, there's nothing pleasant about this, and there's no pressure, as far as I'm concerned, that anyone should engage in what needs to be engaged with. However, we have to be brutally honest with ourselves that overcoming a political regime requires high risk, high return strategies. An example of this, for instance, was the decision by a very small group of people in April 2019 to take control of 5 separate sites in London, right? That was a mad decision. It was a high risk decision because the police very easily could have stopped us getting to the sites and then the whole thing would have failed. But we took the high risk because we wanted the high return of becoming a global mass civil disobedience event, which spread around the world and inspired people, right? But that was basically made by 5 people in a room. So this is what you have to do. You have to delegate tactical authority to a small number of people. Okay, so that's difficult, right? But that seems to be the way it is, right? If you could have great big gatherings of people, that'd be great, but it doesn't seem to be working. So I'm going to leave you on a more general point about the philosophy of revolution in the 21st century. And this is a more general point. I think one of the disasters of radical politics and all politics over the last 200 years has been the regression into what you might call othering. Othering is defined as deciding that other people are dehumanized and therefore you can perpetuate violence and death upon them. And this is like a massive problem in revolutionary movements. It sort of originates in a sort of Calvinist, black and white, reductive idea of good and bad. And it's been a disaster in revolutionary movements for decades and centuries, because what it does is it leads to authoritarianism and, you know, the decision basically to destroy other people's lives and livelihoods. And that may have been a problem in the past, but at the present moment in the 21st century, the fundamental thing we have to understand is we can't get this wrong again. We can't engage in a revolution that engages in that sort of mass violence, because if we do, then we're going to destroy the human race, because the human race is too powerful now to engage in mass violence. It will just destroy itself. So we have no alternative but to engage in a fundamental different philosophy of life, which reorientates ourselves to more traditional notions. In other words, what I'm trying to emphasize last of all here is I'm not being utopian or idealist. I'm being ruthlessly realist that we have to engage in reorientating our philosophy and rediscover the fraternity that was the third element in the French Revolution. In other words, there's equality and liberty, but there's always also fraternity, which is basically the love of each other as human beings. Love defined as the desire for the well-being of the other person. And this needs to be rooted in 2 fundamental spiritual realizations. By spiritual, I don't necessarily mean religious, though it could be religious, but I mean more in a sense of what it is to be human, arguably in the existentialist sense of the European tradition. And the 2 realizations are that all human beings, all human individuals are fundamentally connected in a fundamental sense, we're one organism. If we destroy part of ourselves, we destroy all of ourselves. And again, this is like something that's confirmed by modern science, as well as all our spiritual traditions. The second fundamental realization is that we are not separate from nature. We are nature. You know, we have bodies and they get infected by COVID. We are bodies. We're not just minds. And we can't maintain that Descartes-esque separation between mind and matter. We have to understand nature is us. It's not separate from us. So that really is the fundamental backbone, I think, to this project, that and how that hits the ground is the idea that when you win, you forgive your enemies in the great Christian tradition. And again, this is not due to some high-mindedness. It's due to a realist necessity that in this century, the human race is either going to come together or it's going to destroy itself. We have that fundamental decision to make. So that's really the job. So I just want to finish off by saying, I think everyone, just about everyone anyway, listening to this today will have this realization of the enormous gravity and severity of the crisis we face. In other words, that we can't afford to get this wrong, and that we have to step up into resistance in order to get it right. And I want to leave you then with a quote from probably the most famous European, maybe of the last century, Einstein, the physicist, and I'll leave you with his quote. So he said, "Those who have the privilege to know have the duty to act." That's us. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. Yeah, that's a heavy gift to get this privilege to act. And right now it's even work within me much stronger. Thank you so much for that. And yeah, and I would like to invite us right now to make a small talk. You can ask your questions. I know some of you address your questions to Roger through Przemo, so I will ask you, Przemo, to help us to make this conversation happen. Would you?
Yeah, sure. So I've got a lot of questions already, and I think it's too much to ask all of them. So yeah, I'm really sorry for all the questions that we won't be able to answer probably, and probably not even we not even be able to hear them. So sorry, but still, I'm thinking maybe we could, because I have like 4 or 5 really good questions, I think. But if I'm gonna start reading them, I won't be able to read the ones that are coming now. So maybe we could ask everyone to now start writing questions to Sirius, and yeah, and I will just start with the questions that I have already. I think that's a good idea. So let's do this. And okay, so the first question is from Gav, and it goes like this. In your book, Common Sense for 21st Century, you've been tackling the issues of reformist approach towards fighting climate change and unconscious denial among campaigners, etc. The reformist corporate NGOs are trying to assimilate climate movements in Poland only too often. How to deal with it, remaining in good relationships, but at the same time push for radical change with our own means and tactics?
Yes, well, one of the things I didn't touch upon, particularly in the talk, was that one of the key realizations of radicals over the past centuries is that their biggest opponent are their liberal allies rather than the bad guys that are out there. And that's a very unpleasant realization, because, you know, for an agreeable person like myself, it takes quite a lot of intellectual effort to extract myself from the idea that the people who are supposed to be my friends are actually undermining my efforts. And if you think this is a rather unpleasant and rather extreme position, I would ask you to read Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail, which makes this exact point, which is the biggest opposition to Black liberation, as far as he was concerned, as he wrote that letter in prison, was not the Ku Klux Klan, but the white liberals and the Black liberals who wanted to do more talking, more consultations, more sitting on committees, more petitions, and all the bullshit basically that doesn't work. And after 70 years of failure, Black people in America suddenly realized that they could transform power relationships through mass civil disobedience. And that was the explosion of the civil rights movement. The climate movement is in exactly the same position in 2021, that it's presented with people who are leading the movement and in control of the movement who have no interest in success. Their interest is in maintaining their gatekeeping power, their cultural and financial power in the movement, because the methodologies of activity that they promote, shaking hands with notables, sitting with famous people, going on television, making very sort of generalized, abstract statements of support, all that is bullshit, right? It doesn't work, it never did work, and it's catastrophic in terms of the future design of resistance, which is now necessary, given the absolute severity of what we face. And of course, a large part of this is due to middle-class privilege in the global north, of people being unable or even unwilling to get their heads around what social collapse means. In other words, what communities in the global south are already experiencing and will soon be experienced in the global north. And it's essential, in my view, that young people extract themselves from the influence of NGOs and create their own revolutionary structures along the models of what I outlined in the talk. And I'm saying that not because I'm being hateful or unpleasant to the very hardworking people in NGOs. It's not a personal thing. It's a question of strategic coherence. And we don't have the luxury of more failure at this point in history. So this requires leadership, right? Those of you on this call are the revolutionary leadership. You should acknowledge that and step up to your historical role and make that clear and create parallel institutions and organizations that engage in mass civil resistance, regardless of what the liberal left and the NGO sector think, because with all due respect, their history.
All right, thanks. So the next one is about a very different topic, but it's, so this is how it goes. How do you communicate things like the fact that there is 2 degrees Celsius already locked in according to the recent studies? Does it not lead to inaction? What role of hope and grief do you see in our narrative?
Yeah, well, this is a very common question. And it originates, I suppose, in a desire not to deal with the emotions that come upon us when we realize how totally fucked the situation is. And again, this is a function of privilege and middle-class extraction from the real world. In other words, that you have the idea that you can construct the world along the lines of what you want it to be rather than what it actually is, which is a function of privilege. In other words, poor people in the world don't have that privilege because they've already got the shit in front of them and they don't have the material ability to extract themselves by going on nice holidays or all the rest of it. So we need to understand where it's psychologically coming from, this attitude that we can't tell people the truth and we can't deal with the actuality as it is, and we can't communicate it in visceral terms. As far as the effect of that on mobilization is concerned, this is not an act of faith or ideology. It's a matter of sociological and psychological observation. And Extinction Rebellion was set up with the core observation that when you tell people the truth, two things happen, not one. So the traditional view is one thing happens is people lose hope and they go towards inaction. The actual psychological reality is two things happen. Some people move towards inaction and depression and inaction, and other people move rapidly towards resistance because they're so outraged by the evil that they're faced. And this is shown over and over again when people are faced with awful circumstances. Some people bury their heads in the sand more deeply, but other people act into resistance. And the whole strategy of action of Extinction Rebellion along the lines that I designed when I helped set it up was that when you're doing the Heading for Extinction talk, then you will mobilize people to do civil resistance by telling them the truth. In other words, if you lie to them, they're only going to be sending an email, right? Because they just don't think the situation's that bad. If you think the situation is really bad, then I'd say some people will disappear into hedonism and fatalism, but other people who have a certain sensibility or a certain philosophy of life will enter into dutiful resistance. And that's what we need. Those are the people we need to mobilize. And we only mobilize them by going and telling people the truth in a brutal, everyday, ordinary language way, right? So I emphasize that. You're not going to mobilize people with abstract science talks. You're going to mobilize people as evangelical, like orators, right? And that's a big challenge.
Okay, thanks. So Amanita asked in the chat to ask the question directly to you. So I will let her speak for herself.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, I couldn't focus on writing my question and then listening to you, so sorry, I just wanted to ask myself. Talking about mobilizing and mobilization, I was thinking, how would you propose to talk with real people of the church, especially in Polish context, like there is sort of, situation to diffuse, that the government with the church authority are on one side of the war, and then the left is on the other side. So how would you maybe plan an outreach campaign and to just diffuse this situation and talk with real people?
Okay, so I mentioned two of the things, but I go into it in a little bit more detail. So the first thing to say is it's not easy, okay? So don't let me give you the impression this is straightforward and, it's just a matter of pressing a few buttons. However, historically speaking, it is possible, and it's more possible if you do a few key things. So as I've said in my talk, the key element is to create human connection. Most people will agree to do what you want them to do, not because of your argument, but because of an emotional connection between you and them. In other words, a sense of mutual respect. Human beings are not primarily cognitive, they're emotional. If they don't like you, even if you've got the best argument in the world, you probably noticed they're not going to agree. So engaging on an argumentative level initially with an opponent, whether it's someone in the church or a conservative businessman or whatever, is a disastrous strategy, right? What you want to engage in is a listening exercise. So for instance, you could go to a parish and go to the priest and say, we want to talk to you about the climate situation. And you enter the conversation and said, would you like to talk to us about how you see the problems in the church in relation to the ecological crisis? And you allow them to speak and you summarize what they say so that they understand that you have heard what they said. Being heard is a primary mechanism to create emotional connection, as we all know. You know, if you're upset and someone listens to you, you like them, right? You can't help yourself. So even though they're saying things that you intellectually don't agree with, by showing that empathy, you make that connection. Once you've got that minimal amount of connection and empathy, you can move on to a next stage. The next stage is to make intellectual arguments which are framed within the cultural and political tradition of their culture. In other words, you don't use secular, intellectual, middle-class, urban, Polish arguments, right? They're not interested in that. What they want to know is quotes from the New Testament on why Jesus believed in maintaining, you know, justice and ecological sustainability. In other words, you appeal to them on the basis of their own values. And one of the fantastic things, as you might say, about the climate crisis is the crisis is an affront and a violation of all human values, in the same sense as the Nazi invasion of countries around Europe was in 1940s. So you can see a historical example of this, for instance, in the resistance movements, where conservative Catholics, you know, fought on the same side as radical socialists. Those two groups have been at total loggerheads for hundreds of years, right? But they came together because the Nazi threat was an affront to all human values. So that's the common ground you have as you face the crisis. The third element, and this is like the most important in a way, in terms of rolling out a mobilization on groups that you don't necessarily like, is, as I said in the talk, was to recruit some of the people from that demographic to talk to the other people. So one of the main ways you mobilize is knowing someone like you is mobilizing. You know this because, like, if your friend's going to a demonstration, you're likely to go to the demonstration as well because you're like your friend. If another young person speaks to you and you're a young person, you're more likely to do it than if an old person does. So if you get a radical priest or whatever, he or she, is he, isn't it? Yes, he will go. You want to stick that person on tour, right? To go and talk to the parishes or whatever they're called in Poland. So one of the things we developed in the UK and in Australia we're developing is recruiting working class people to talk to working class people. This is an essential part of mass mobilization. And the important thing to understand, of course, is that they're quite likely to not be good speakers, right? But your definition as a middle-class intellectual urban person doesn't matter. Good speakers don't need to be coherent. They need to be emotional and talk the language of the people they're talking to. And what happens over and over again is university-educated speakers train ordinary people to become bad speakers by forcing them to slot into middle-class conceptions of what effective communication is, right? The most effective communicators are usually working class in my experience because they're more gutsy, right? More shit's happened to them and they have more credibility when they're talking to people, in the same way as women over 50 are really good communicators as well, because lots of crap's happened to women over 50. So that's something to consider, right? All the articulate young middle-class student types, you need to be stuffing the envelopes, right? The people who are leading the movement have to be the older women, the young kids, and the farmers and the businessmen, right? In other words, the demographics who are going to appeal and neutralize the opposition groups. So we're doing like a big mobilization in the UK, and we'll probably be blocking roads, and this is going to lead to a lot of, you know, bad publicity, but we're going to have two working class guys who've spent 30 years doing manual work talking to the press. You get the idea? That's what you need, right? So it's a bit of a come down for all your big sort of intellectual egos, as you might say. Sorry about that. Nothing personal.
All right. So I've got two questions that I think close to each other. So maybe I will try to ask them both at the same time. So one goes like this: where does non-violence end? Is graffiti or breaking windows violent? How to answer that question as a mass movement? And how do you keep, and why do you keep non-violence if police is violent towards you? And also the second question is, how do you perform radical actions, high risk, high gain, and still remain inviting for people from outside? I see a risk of being perceived as radicals. So I hope it's not too much for one question.
That's definitely too much. To do each of those questions justice, I need at least 15 minutes. Otherwise, I'll sound a bit dogmatic. So I apologize if I'm going to give simplistic answers to them, but I'll try and outline the situation. So one of the important things to understand about nonviolent action is that it's not primarily material. Like, the effect of it is primarily psychological. In other words, it's not what you do, it's the psychological communication that you make with the opponent. So what this means is that you can engage in criminal damage, i.e. the destruction of property, but depending upon how you do it will determine whether it's non-violent or not. So the big division here in terms of classical non-violence theory is whether something is open or closed. And there's modern sort of psychological research that shows if people don't show their face, or if they're secretive, or if you don't know who's done something, then the observers will instinctively be opposed to those people. And this is a deep evolutionary impulse, that if you don't know who people are, then you get over-polarization, as it's called. In other words, people move too far against you. Now, the opposite occurs if you are open and fearless in your actions. So if you go and, like, alter property, as you might say, and you're fearless about it and you're open, in other words, you stand there after you've thrown paint on something and say, this is what I've done, do your worst, we're right, then that has two things. People respect you because you've been open in what you've done. They can see your face, they can see you in court, and they can see you when you make your public statements. But a converse sort of psychological dynamic happens, which is when people are fearless and they show fearlessness, there's a deep evolutionary attraction to it, which arguably goes back to, being able to run away from lions or whatever, who knows. But the upshot of it is if someone's fearless, even if you're opposed to their political opinions, you'll have a grudging respect. So again, this is a matter of moving away from a reductive left-wing Enlightenment notion of human nature. People are not primarily political analyzers, they're emotional beings. And if they see someone who's fearless, then they will be attracted to them. And you can see this dynamic happening often, of course, on the attraction to right-wing leaders and right-wing popularists who pursue fearlessness as a major mechanism to attract people to right-wing popularism. And the big problem with left-wing movements is they don't understand they have to be open and fearless in order to counteract that right-wing appeal. And this is what the backfiring effect, which is the central mechanism of non-violence theory, is all about, which is you go out and be fearless, get arrested, get thrown into prison, get beaten up, whatever it is. And through the very process of that confrontation, you attract sympathy and support. So what I would say is that it's not so much what you do, it's how you do it. Having said that, obviously, there's some hard line sort of divisions between violence and non-violence, i.e. not engaging in things that can lead to the physical harm of another person, which is a clear boundary. And there are obviously, murky areas in between, which, non-violent scholars spend their lives arguing about. But I think in terms of general design, those are the things to bear in mind. But what I want to emphasize here is this is a fundamental break, right, from the hard left Calvinist tradition, right, which is based upon destruction of the enemy, right, not conversion of the enemy. These are very different traditions. And there's an element in Extinction Rebellion which doesn't understand that openness has a radical effectiveness, right? And closeness just produces corruption and paranoia and machismo behavior. So there's an internal side to these dynamics as well as an external side. So when you read about Gandhi and Martin Luther King, when they started their movements, they made an absolute commitment to be open, but not because they were being ethical, but because they knew that was the most effective way to engage in the social struggle they're involved in. And so that's that. The second question is about preventing violence from happening when the police overreact and what have you. Strangely enough, in terms of the sociological record, this doesn't necessarily need to be a massive problem. The way in which human beings work is that if everyone else is being non-violent, then it's extremely difficult to engage in violence yourself. And conversely, if lots of people start being violent, you will find it very difficult to remain non-violent. So the key design element here is to place non-violence at the center of your philosophy of action, so that everybody who engages in confrontation with the police then has that non-violence training. And secondly, in so much as there's a possibility of violence happening in the field, as it were, there's de-escalation teams which will go up to angry young men, who's usually is, and calm them down. So there's a number of semi-humorous ways of doing this, of involving grandmothers and people going around with, what was it? They did it in Italy. Cream on plates. So as soon as the black bloc turned up or something, these guys would run up and put cream into their faces and make them look ridiculous, so they couldn't be so macho. But I don't suggest you do that as a main policy. The main two things are to make it clear that the movement is non-violent, and be really dogmatic about that. Because as soon as you lose it, like you've seen in places like Egypt or Syria, then all that happens historically is a descent into civil war, and that obviously is a disaster. So again, this isn't a moral thing, it's a practical thing in terms of success. And interestingly enough, when people maintain non-violence, even when they're threatened with injury and death, they do maintain it, right? So you should never underestimate the power of collective norms. Collective norms overall are individual emotions in many situations. Okay, so the last thing is, if you do high risk actions, do you put people off? So this is a difficult argument which rages in the UK, as you may know. So one of the sort of disastrous tendencies, in my view, in Extinction Rebellion is the notion that if you upset the population, then you'll lose support and become unsuccessful. This is illiterate, right? Non-violence theory is based upon the opposite. Only when you upset the majority of the population will you be successful, because resistance requires confrontation, and confrontation leads to people attending to what you have to say. And that's what disruption does. This is not an emotion-free cognitive process. It's not people looking at you and looking at the information on climate change and going, guess what? Those people are right, because we're heading towards 2 degrees. The process is those people are complete fuckers because they've stopped me from getting to work 4 days in a row. And that means they must have a good reason, right? That's how it works, okay? So people enter into an internal dialogue or talk to the people in their family, and millions of conversations happen. And the conversations go something like this. Those fuckers have stopped us getting to work. I hate them. And that climate change business is rubbish. but that's the first time they thought about climate change, right? They haven't thought about climate change. So that's the first step. Then the second step is those people are complete idiots, but at least they're showing guts. At least they show their face. At least they walk their talk, right? And then the third stage is, I don't like their tactics, but they're right. And the fifth stage is, I'm going down to join them because it's cool, right? So you have a normal distribution curve. And the more you engage in disciplined civil disobedience, the more all those demographics move towards support, right? As long as you get it right. So the idea that you're going to be unpopular and lose support is total nonsense. So I give you a historical example. Like in 1961, Martin Luther King was the most feared and hated man in America, right? Why was that? Because he was undermining the structural racism and the contradiction in American society. And people hated that, right? People hate being shown to be hypocrites. No wonder they're upset with you. And in 1967, he was the most popular man in America because everyone had realized he's right. So you have to become the most unpopular movement in Poland. And in 6 years' time, you'll all be heroes and they'll be building statues of you and all that business, right? That's how it works. It's a hard deal, right? It's not about polite middle-class conversations. So as far as I'm concerned, as long as you maintain a respectful attitude towards the opposition, as long as you maintain radical openness, you destroy as much as you can, okay? You know, you should be going out and closing the country down because that's what's required, because we're in an absolute emergency. And that's what I mean by revolutionary leadership, right? You need leaders like me, you need lots of Roger Hallams in Poland going, guys, we're all going to prison because that's what's necessary at this stage, right? And once you do that, like you saw in the Serbian revolution in the 90s, once people get used to a level of resistance, then it becomes culturalized, right? It's not a big deal because that's what it looks like. If you go to resistance struggles in the global south, this is what they deal with all the time, right? They don't collapse in a heap. They get on with it because they create communities of resistance. And that's the process, the transition that you need to facilitate in the resistant movements in Poland.
Okay, that was important statement. Now I really would like to finish our talk and go out the street and do what is necessary. But also thank you for this 6 years and to help us to be patient and wait and see the process that needs to go on. We are almost getting to an end, so I would like to ask Zofia to ask her question. Maybe that would be the last question. That depends how long the answer and the question would be. And let's see, and there may be one more and we will get to the shore. Wow. Zofia.
Now I feel the pressure.
Nice to hear also women's voice in the discussion.
Okay, so I'll try to be quick. I wanted to ask because in XRs and in your vision of revolution, there is like a central central moment of getting back power by the people and civil assemblies that decide about the future. And I guess it's obvious that before civil assemblies happen, we need to also change like paradigms and ideology and philosophy people believe in, as you said, about like psychophysical dualism. And I think about like the religion of growth, economic growth. There are things we need to change on the level of hearts and minds. And I'm wondering, what is your thought about like the relation between this political change on the level of structure of power and this ideological change on level of what people believe in and what they are raised in? Which one has to come first? And do we need to like prioritize maybe this ideological change now, or what to do with those two things? Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's a very important question, and there's a massive misunderstanding about how political change works, in my view, which is, and this is what you might call the sort of elitist, sort of idealist position, Enlightenment tradition, which says we can go out and through the force of argument, we will change the way people think. That simply isn't the case. The way that people radicalize is through the experience of action and through the experience of social confrontation. And that opens up a potentiality for a change in their philosophy and a change in their worldview. In other words, like while people are sitting in relative comfort, there's no cognitive incentive to change where they think because they know what they think, right? When people change, as I've just said in the previous answer, people change through emotional arousal. In other words, the emotional arousal provides the opportunity to provide an ideological sense. So obviously this is somewhat tricky because people have to engage in civil resistance before they know all the right answers. So it's risky, but it's absolutely necessary. And what most elitist sort of idealist movements do is they create gatekeepering mechanisms, and they say, you're not radical enough, you know, you're not in tune enough with nature, you don't use the same language, so you can't join our group. That's a disaster because, as we've established, you need mass participation. So what you have to do is engage in mobilizing them about within their own cultural frame initially, okay? So the initial framing has to be within the Christian framework or the small capitalist framework or a farming network framework. However, once they've engaged in the act of struggle, as it were, once they've been arrested, once they've experienced the high of, you know, civil resistance and the low of sitting in a prison cell for 4 days, then they're ready to reconsider their core beliefs. And that's the place for what you might call an intellectual elite, to basically guide the movement into a new philosophy of life, of saying, okay, this is what we need to be thinking. We've experienced social conflict and we need to be guided into a spiritual path which emphasizes that the opponent is not our enemy, is just another aspect of ourselves. And this is the role of leadership, which you see with Martin Luther King and Gandhi. And this is what prevents over-polarization, because the big danger of social confrontation, as we all know, is that the opposition becomes even more extreme and hardened, and that leads to pathways towards violence and social collapse. So it's essential that you can reach out as a movement through confrontation, but also in a respectful way to your opponent, and make clear that you're not opposed to them as individuals, as people. You're opposed to their actions. And again, this sounds very moralistic and idealistic, but it's absolutely realist, right? You know, in the classical civil resistance movements, when you see those pictures of people putting flowers in the rifles of the soldiers, right? They're not being hippie, right? They're doing that because it's effective, because they don't want to get shot. They want to ensure that those peasant soldiers defect, and they do that by showing love towards those soldiers in the classical definition of seeking their goodwill. So that's the sequence, you know, is to engage in their frame, encourage them to enter the frame of action, and then through the emotionality of that action, then you've got the possibility of changing their core beliefs. And you know, good luck. Because, you know, it's tricky, right? It's a messy process. As you know, I mean, I encourage you all to read some history, right? Everyone should be reading the history of rebellions and revolutions, because they all have the same sociological structures and challenges. And through that, you can see what succeeds and what doesn't, because that's what you need to become experts in this, far better than me. And, you know, that's your job. Not reading about, you know, the Arctic, right? Read about the Serbian Revolution or something. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. We will.
Have you read? Do you have that book in Poland? Blueprint for revolution.
Blueprint for revolution. Not yet. Not yet.
A good start. A good starter.
Yeah, it is.
Revolution with a smile on your face. I didn't mention that. It's always good to keep a smile on your face.
Yeah.
Almost all circumstances.
Always when I'm hearing about Strija Popovic and the Serbian Revolution, it makes me smile because they were really also really funny and humorous people. With all this very heavy fight they fought. So yeah, I think so. Okay, do you have still capacity for the last question? I think that might be very practical question to wrap it up and to finish our talk, or
that's fine with me. Yeah, I'm sure everyone else is starting to wilt, but I'll try and make it quick. I think we've covered the main subjects really, so that's good. And I'll just say something at the end if that's okay.
Okay. So would you like to say it now, or would you?
Yeah. No, you've got another question, yeah?
Okay, so the last question, because it's very similar. We have few very similar questions. I will also wrap it, and yeah, I think it's something also very practical and important for us. So the question is, what risks or challenges you see in having so-called leader generals? You talk about the small tactic leadership in progressive revolutionary movement, and how should or could this risk be mitigated? So yeah, how to follow the nature, and on the one hand to take the leaders, natural leaders that are popping up. As you said, probably we all are the leaders, the people who are participating this call right now, but also how to mitigate the risk or the,
Yeah. So interestingly enough, I read this week that the ancient Athenians used to vote their generals for a year. And if they were no good, they'd get rid of them and get another general. So that's the first answer, right? There's a 2,000-year tradition of accountable hierarchy, right? Which basically means if the guys are shit, you get rid of them. And there's a constitutional mechanism. So this is being developed. So we don't need to juxtapose some authoritarian nightmare leader with, chaotic horizontalism. There's a continuum of structures. And in the middle of that continuum are a number of different mechanisms through which you can hold a leader accountable. So for instance, by them having limited powers, by them being elected in, and by having a limited term. Those are the main mechanisms, right? And no one's pretending that this is problem-free. It's problematic, but it's obviously a lot less problematic than having a charismatic leader for life type person, or having a chaos where no one knows what's happening, because that's, leads to failure. So that's the usual answer to it. But I happen to think that there's another potentially more powerful element, which is the spiritual and cultural depth of the movement. In other words, all successful leaders are embedded in a spiritual and moral culture. And that spiritual moral culture rotates around the notion of service to the common good. In other words, the leaders that come forward are dedicated to service, not to their ego. Now, that's easy to say, of course, and again, there's a continuum. But the fact of the matter is that culture does influence behavior. And if you create a movement which promotes that notion of service, then you'll have more high quality individuals, as it were, stepping up into that role. And rather than, a debased, materialistic culture of power and conflict. So to that extent, Extinction Rebellion has been reasonably successful, that the people that have taken leadership positions, and arguably myself, are motivated primarily by service, right? I really don't give a shit about being famous, and I don't give a shit about having loads of money or anything, right? I'm just here to get the job done and act in service. That doesn't mean I don't make mistakes, doesn't mean that I'm not sometimes shit at what I do. But what it means is the culture has created a certain type of leadership potential. So, that goes back to all these soft elements, as you might say. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. So I think we will end the Q&A here. And I also heard that you would like to make like the last word or final statement.
Well, you can have the last word if you want. I don't mind. But I just wanted to round up by thanking everyone for bearing with me. And I sense it, you know, quite a lot of these points are quite complicated and complex. But I want to challenge everyone to engage with them because, as I said, you're the people in the country who are going to be taking leadership positions, whether you like it or not. And you need to step up into those leadership positions and you have to educate yourselves into the literature, right? So I've given you a summary of that literature. Obviously, I put my own frame on it and you mustn't take what I've said as objective, right? I'm making a contribution and I'm entering into dialogue with you. So if you think one element of what I've said is wrong, then you should not follow it, right? You should think for yourselves and take what you need and leave the rest. That's always the appropriate way to look at intellectual contributions. You don't need to swallow it whole. And I would look forward to more of you engaging on these issues. And as I said, hopefully Poland's going to lead the world. So I've got the best of, I've got the highest expectations of you. Worry about the pressure. So I'll leave it like that. But thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. Maybe we should leave it here.
Yeah.
Our national pride. That's a risk.
Yeah, always appeal to national pride. I forgot to mention that. It always goes down a treat. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Roger. I think so many words and so many inspiration we heard here. So I don't want to cover that with another sentences. Thank you so much, especially because we still are a young movement. So for me, and I think I'm talking also on behalf of many others, it's good to have and to talk with our older fellow colleague from the movement. It's also important to see your perspective. Like we don't have this elders still in the movement and the people who went through, and so that's very important for me. Maybe somebody else is also feeling this gratefulness from that point. Well, so much to do and so great to be on that way together. Thank you all as well to join us and to participate and to take, as Roger said, whatever necessary, what you don't need, what you don't want, just leave it on your way. But let's move forward because it's now or never.
Thanks so much. See you in a bit.
Thank you.
Bye.